Torpedo 1. Torpedo 2. Spread angle. Distance decreasing.
Maintain course. We must reach the convoy by dawn.
Die See ist ruhig, mir ist es zu ruhig.
Bring us up 2 meters. Increase speed.
January 12, 1942. North Atlantic. Pre-dawn darkness hangs low over the sea, thick and heavy like a wool blanket soaked in icy water. A German Type 7 U-boat cuts slowly through the black swells just south of Iceland. The winter wind drags a long howl across the conning tower, and frozen spray crusts thick layers of ice along the railing. Inside the bridge, Captain Lieutenant Otto Meissner presses cold binoculars against his face, his breath turning white in the air. He listens to the groan of the hull as it rises and falls with each long Atlantic wave. Every sound feels amplified in the dark. The creak of steel, the thump of a valve, the faint vibration of the diesel engines far below. It is the hour before dawn when even the most experienced sailors feel their nerves tighten. A weak glimmer of moonlight slips between ragged clouds, just enough to reveal the distant shape of a merchant ship struggling through the storm. No escort, no aircraft, no other ships for miles. Meissner lowers the binoculars and whispers to his watch officer. They had been stalking this target for hours through freezing wind and heaving seas. Now the moment is close. The U-boat slides forward, barely visible above the black water. The crew inside the control room works in a cramped world of dim red lighting, the air thick with diesel and sweat. A petty officer rubs his hands together over a small heating pipe as he counts the seconds of the firing solution. The chief engineer wipes condensation from the pressure gauge with the sleeve of his coat. Everyone listens for the voice from the attack periscope. Meissner shifts his weight and steadies himself against the movement of the sea. His boots scrape lightly against the metal floor. He raises the binoculars one last time. The merchant ship is nothing special, just another slow freighter loaded with grain and military trucks bound for Britain. But to Meissner it represents something larger. It is one more blow in the campaign they expect will decide the fate of the war. Their orders are simple. Choke Britain, cut off its food, cut off its fuel, break its lifeline before American factories can react. Every thinking adds weight to the belief that Germany can still starve the island into submission. The waves crash across the bow, sending icy spray over the watch crew. Meissner gives the order to dive. The men slip into the hatch as the sea pours over the deck. The conning tower hatch slams shut with a metallic echo, and the boat tilts slightly as it slides beneath the surface. The water darkens around the glass of the attack periscope. Inside the control room, the temperature drops as cold seawater clings to the steel skin of the boat. The hum of machinery fills the narrow space. Crewmen move quickly to their stations, brushing past each other in the tight corridor. The navigator calls out depth. 30 feet, 40. 50. The boat steadies. The tension in the room rises. Meissner leans over the periscope eyepiece. The merchant ship still holds its course. Steam rises from its funnel, pale and ghost-like in the faint light. He whispers a calculation under his breath. Torpedo 1, Torpedo 2, spread angle, distance decreasing. In the bow compartment, sailors crouch beside the tubes. The smell of oil mixes with the cold, damp air. One of the younger sailors touches a small Lucky Charm tied to his coat zipper. Another closes his eyes for a moment and exhales slowly, trying to calm the pounding of his heart. The sea outside muffles all sound, but inside the boat every whisper seems sharp. Meissner calls the firing order. A tense silence hangs over the crew. Then the boat jerks slightly as the first torpedo shoots out of the tube. A second follows. The crew waits in absolute stillness. The seconds stretch out like long wires pulled tight. In the bow, the sailors listen for a distant impact that may or may not come. Meissner keeps his eye on the periscope, his breath fogging the cold brass ring around the eyepiece. Then, far ahead, a flicker of orange light flashes across the surface. A deep rumble follows a moment later. The merchant ship heaves upward as if lifted by an invisible hand and then breaks open in the center. Flames rise against the dark sky, pushed sideways by the wind. Some of the crew let out a quiet exhale. Others simply stare. It is another kill in what they believe is a battle of numbers they can win. Meissner straightens slowly, lowering the periscope. For now, the sea is quiet again. Only the distant crackle of burning fuel and the slow churn of the U-boat's electric motors break the silence. But no one aboard realizes that across the ocean, in American shipyards they have never heard of, something is already unfolding that will soon overturn everything they think they understand about this war. The morning of June 18, 1942 unfolded across the North Atlantic with the same unforgiving grayness that had defined the battle for months. The wind curled in long cold lashes across the surface, pulling sheets of spray into the air and bending them away toward the horizon as if to hide the violence beneath. German U-boats moved silently through these waters, engines pulsing low, hulls cutting through the depths with the steady confidence of hunters who believe the ocean belongs to them. The commanders of the Atlantic wolf packs carried the same thought through every patrol report they transmitted back to headquarters in Paris and Berlin. Britain was close to strangulation. The mathematics of tonnage seemed to promise German victory. Sink enough merchant ships, starve the island, force Churchill to the table. It was a belief as clear to them as the chill on their skin each time the boats surfaced. Inside Germany, the leadership shared that certainty. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, the architect of the U-boat fleet, repeated it during briefings. Germany did not need to defeat the Royal Navy in a classic battle. They only needed to remove the merchant ships that carried oil, wheat, munitions, and steel from the New World to Britain. For months, the calculations appeared correct. Convoys burned in the night, torpedoes hit home, plumes of smoke rose over the horizon, and the glow of sinking ships reflected off the underbellies of circling patrol aircraft. Sailors clung to wreckage as the cold water closed around them. Every sinking made the German crews believe they were tightening a rope. The phrase "the noose is closing" often appeared in messages sent back from the wolf packs. What the commanders did not understand, at least not yet, was how different the strategic picture looked on the other side of the ocean. In Washington and along both coasts, a new idea had begun to take shape. American leaders were not only preparing to replace ships already lost, they were preparing to flood the ocean with more ships than Germany believed any nation could produce in a single year. In Britain, the government read each intelligence report with growing tension. They understood that the next months would decide everything. Without the thousands of tons of food and fuel arriving weekly from the Atlantic lifeline, the country would be unable to continue the war. Churchill told his war cabinet that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him. British citizens heard explosions at night when ships were torpedoed close to shore. Beaches were littered with debris, barrels, and sometimes bodies. The German High Command interpreted those scenes as proof that their plan was working. They believed American industry was strong but slow. They assumed that the United States, even with its vast resources, would require long months to get shipbuilding into full motion. German intelligence officers estimated that American shipyards could at best replace what was being lost, not exceed it. They believed the old methods of riveting hulls and assembling sections by hand would limit production. That belief shaped every patrol plan and every message Donitz sent out. Continue pressure, continue sinking, victory will come through attrition. Yet in America, the situation was moving in a direction that no German commander imagined. A transformation was happening in the shipyards of the West Coast and the Gulf Coast. Welders, electricians, engineers, carpenters, and foremen worked under floodlights through the night. Trains carrying steel plate rolled into factories that operated without pause. Henry Kaiser, a builder with no shipbuilding background before the war, had created a new system that shocked even American naval officials. Instead of building ships piece by piece as earlier generations had done, workers assembled enormous prefabricated sections using welding rather than slow rivets. Those sections were joined like building blocks. Each yard became a giant machine powered by thousands of hands. Meanwhile, Britain watched the changing American plans with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Reports coming across the Atlantic suggested that the United States was not only catching up but preparing to overtake Germany's destruction rate. British escorts tried to hold the convoy together as winter storms tore at the hulls. Men on the bridge looked at wind meters and barometers, wondering if they would face a U-boat attack that night. Those escorts were often outnumbered by unseen submarines lurking beneath them. On the German side, the atmosphere carried a sense of grim confidence. Submarine commanders wrote in their patrol logs that each sinking moved the war closer to a favorable end. Many believed the United States could not adapt quickly enough. The scale of the ocean and the speed of destruction seemed too great for any country to overcome. Even when reports reached headquarters suggesting American yards were expanding faster than expected, the idea of ships being built in days rather than months was dismissed as nonsense. German planners had spent their careers around traditional shipbuilding. They could not imagine an assembly line applied to an ocean-going vessel. In this moment, the situation across the Atlantic balanced between two clashing realities. One side believed industrial limits would guarantee victory. The other side was preparing to rewrite those limits entirely. What neither side fully understood, at least not yet, was how quickly the balance would shift once the first Liberty ships rolled down the ways. The sea lanes that had burned red in the winter would soon be filled with the sound of hammers, welders, and engines echoing from American coasts. The unseen contest between torpedoes and factories was entering its most critical phase, and the men on both sides sensed a turning point approaching, even if they could not yet see it clearly. The sun was still low over the Atlantic on that same morning in early April 1942 when Captain Lieutenant Helmut Weiss stepped into the conning tower of U-153. The light was pale and cool, cutting through a thin layer of mist that clung to the surface like a great sheet of steel wool. Weiss pulled his leather jacket tighter around him and squinted at the horizon. The ocean was calm, almost serene, which only made the tension aboard more noticeable. Behind him, the hatch clanged shut and the smell of diesel fumes drifted upward. He was 33 years old, sharp-faced, blond, and carried the thin, exhausted look of a man who had spent too long beneath the waves. His boat had been at sea for 12 days, hunting freighters trying to reach Britain. Weiss believed he was part of a campaign that would decide the fate of the war. Like many U-boat commanders, he was confident that the Atlantic belonged to them. Below decks, the men of U-153 worked in a cramped, humid world where space was so limited that sailors slept in shifts, sharing bunks still warm from the previous occupant. They were mostly young, some barely 20. They believed the same thing their officers believed, that one determined crew could topple a supply line holding up an entire empire. Weiss treated them sternly but fairly. He knew their fears because he felt the same ones rising in his stomach each time. He heard the distant thrum of aircraft engines. His second-in-command, Oberleutnant Fritz Adler, was quieter, more analytical. Adler kept a small notebook in his breast pocket, filled with headings about convoy routes, escort patterns, and weather shifts. He had once studied engineering before joining the Navy. He admired how machines could change the pace of war, but he did not yet understand how American factories were about to append everything he thought he knew. Far across the world, on the American West Coast, Henry Kaiser stood at the edge of the new shipway in Richmond, California. He wore a hard hat and a long coat and surveyed the forest of cranes rising into the morning fog. The yard was alive with noise, sparks, and movement. He was 60 years old but walked with the energy of a man half his age. Kaiser was not a naval officer or an admiral or a shipwright raised in tradition. He was a builder, a man who had carved dams out of mountains and highways across the desert. He believed anything could be built faster if you questioned old habits. Weld a ship instead of riveting it. Prefabricate the sections. Bring the pieces together like a giant puzzle. Where others saw problems, Kaiser saw a schedule. Beside him that morning stood Chief Engineer Frank Spencer, a stiff-jawed veteran of ship construction who had once believed Kaiser's ideas were reckless. Welds on that scale, he argued months earlier, would tear under stress. Prefabrication would never align properly. The hull would twist. The ship would fail at sea. Yet Spencer had watched the process evolve and had seen the quality improve with every hull struck and every plate lowered into place. By 1942, He had become one of Kaiser's fiercest defenders. Inside the welding shed, a 21-year-old woman named Lena Brooks adjusted her goggles and guided a bright white arc along the edge of a steel panel. Sparks showered the ground around her boots. The noise was overwhelming, but she focused on steady breathing and the slow sweep of her wrist. Lena had grown up far from the sea in Oklahoma, yet now she was part of a workforce that stretched from coast to coast. She thought of her brother Daniel, serving with the Army somewhere in the Pacific. Every shift she pulled felt like a step toward protecting him. When Kaiser talked about speed, Lena understood it in a deeply personal way. Every extra day saved might mean one more convoy arriving, one more soldier supplied, one more chance for Daniel to come home. Back in the Atlantic, the men convoying those supplies faced their own fears. On the bridge of the British freighter SS Portwell, Captain Arthur Harrington scanned the fog with binoculars. His cargo held grain, fuel drums, and crated aircraft parts bound for Liverpool. Harrington was 52, steady, patient, and had survived 2 sinkings already. He trusted his escorting corvettes, but he also knew the ocean was vast. He could feel danger even in the quiet moments. The boiler room roared below his boots and the ship trembled with each swell. He knew somewhere out there, invisible beneath the cold waves, men like Weiss were watching and waiting. All of these individuals, spread across thousands of miles, would collide through the consequences of one industrial revolution in American shipyards. Weiss hunting for targets, Kaiser trying to prove the impossible was possible, Harrington praying each day to stay ahead of the wolf packs, Lena welding steel for men she would never meet. Their beliefs, fears, and expectations shaped every decision they made. None of them realized in early 1942 how quickly the balance of the Atlantic would shift, or how much their own stories would change because of the speed at which Liberty ships began to slide into the sea. The wind shifted across the surface of the Atlantic that afternoon, pushing long rolling swells toward the east as U-153 crept along at periscope depth. Inside the cramped control room, every sound felt sharper, more defined. The creak of steel bulkheads, the soft clatter of tools in a storage rack, the steady hum of the electric motors. Captain Lieutenant Weiss kept his eye pressed against the periscope eyepiece, turning it slowly in a smooth arc. The surface looked calm, broken only by streaks of foam. Then he caught it, a thin plume of smoke on the horizon. He breathed out slowly. Smoke meant engines. Engines meant a target. His pulse quickened. He lowered the periscope and gave a quiet order. Bring us up 2 meters. Increase speed. Below, sailors moved quickly, hands sweating as they adjusted valves and dials. The boat rose just enough for Weiss to catch a clearer look through the periscope. The black plume grew thicker. Then the silhouette came into view, a merchantman running light, pushing through the swells. The freighter was alone, maybe straggling from a convoy, maybe unlucky. Either way, it was vulnerable, and Weiss felt the familiar tightening in his chest. The first clash of any patrol was always the same, hope mixed with adrenaline, confidence shadowed by the memory of friends lost in earlier voyages. On the surface, aboard the SS Portwell, Captain Harrington stood on the bridge and frowned at the uneven pattern of the waves. Something felt wrong. He had learned over years at sea to sense danger without seeing it. The smell of the wind, the rhythm of the ship, the faint vibration in the deck. He raised his binoculars and scanned the horizon. Nothing, only water and sky. Still, he ordered the helm to alter course 3 degrees starboard. A tiny shift, almost nothing, but sometimes that was enough. His first officer glanced at him with curiosity, but Harrington only said he had a feeling. A commander did not need to explain instincts born from years of dodging threats under gray northern skies. Deep beneath them, Weiss whispered to Adler, "Ready the tubes." The control room darkened as red lights switched on to preserve visibility. Sailors moved around each other in the tight space, bumping shoulders, gripping handrails, waiting for the order they knew was coming. In those tense minutes, the temperature seemed to rise. Sweat formed on brows. The air thickened with the smell of oil and electricity. Weiss checked the periscope again. The freighter was clear now, cutting through the waves at a steady pace. He felt the boat sway gently. He raised a hand, and the torpedo officer watched carefully. Fire 1. The boat shuddered. A hiss of compressed air. A soft metallic thump. The torpedo slid into the dark water, leaving a trail of bubbles behind. Aboard the portwell, the lookout midshipman lowered his binoculars, blinked, and then froze. A white streak carved through the waves off the port side. His voice cracked as he shouted, "Torpedo port side." Harrington reacted instantly. Hard to port. Engines full. The helmsman spun the wheel. The freighter groaned as it leaned into the turn. The streak of foam raced closer, closing the distance between life and death in seconds. "Inside you 153. Weiss held the periscope steady and muttered a quiet count. 5 seconds. 4. 3. The torpedo ran straight and true. He expected the flash, the column of water rising, the vibration through the hull. Instead, he saw the freighter twist at the last moment, the torpedo passing just behind its stern. Weiss swore softly. The ship had dodged. He lowered the periscope and barked for a course correction. In the boiler room of the portwell, stokers felt the ship lurch violently and scrambled to keep their balance. One man hit his shoulder against the hot metal of the furnace door and cursed through gritted teeth. Another grabbed a handrail and yelled to keep the pressure steady. The entire ship seemed to tremble with urgency. On the bridge, Harrington kept his eyes on the water, waiting for signs of the submarine. He had seen torpedoes miss before, but he also knew U-boat captains almost never gave up after one shot. Weiss ordered the boat deeper. The hull groaned as water pressure increased. He wanted to set up a second attack from a different angle, but the ocean shifted. A distant rumble vibrated through the steel shell. Depth charges. Somewhere, an escort had heard the commotion, or perhaps a patrol aircraft had spotted their wake. Weiss felt a cold wave of dread settle into his gut. He whispered for silence. Every man held his breath, as if the water itself were listening. Above them, the sea exploded. Columns of water shot upward as charges detonated. The shock waves slammed into the hull. Lights flickered. Tools rattled against the bulkheads. A young seaman flinched and bit down on his lip to stop himself from crying out. Weiss gripped a pipe above his head to steady himself. He had been through worse, but each blast reminded him that one miscalculation could crush them like an empty can. For the next 10 minutes, the Atlantic became a world of thunder. The U-boat rocked and quivered. Plaster dust drifted from the seams overhead. Men stood rigid, jaws clenched, waiting for the next impact. Somewhere beyond the noise, beyond the pressure and fear, the freighter portwell pushed ahead, engines straining, hoping distance alone could save them. This was the first clash of that early spring. A U-boat hunting with confidence, a freighter dodging with instinct, and beneath the waves, with steel and sweat as their shield, Weiss and his men felt the first hint that the ocean was beginning to resist them more fiercely than before. The next morning broke gray and heavy over the mid-Atlantic as U-153 drifted silently at depth, her electric motors humming at their lowest setting. The men were exhausted from the pounding of the night before. Their eyes were red, their faces pale under the dim red lights. Even the air felt worn out, thick with the smell of sweat, diesel, and metal. Weiss stood near the chart table, one hand pressed against the bulkhead as if feeling the pulse of the boat itself. Every creak echoed like a warning. Every faint sound stirred a new wave of tension in the cramped hull. He opened his small leather notebook and jotted a single line. Charges from unknown escort. Heavy pursuit possible. He closed the notebook slowly, thinking of the early patrols of the war when the sea had seemed wide open. Back then, U-boat crews moved with near arrogance, slipping through shipping lanes, firing torpedoes, and vanishing before escorts could react. But now, in early 1942, the feeling had changed. The sea was beginning to press back with a strength Weiss had not felt before. New aircraft, new escorts, more convoys, more vigilance. The ocean itself felt more hostile. In the forward quarters, Adler sat on his bunk and rewound the spring on his pocket watch, a nervous habit he had developed during his first patrol. The metal ticked faintly in his hands. Across from him, Seaman Coates leaned against the hull, eyes half closed, listening for the faintest shift in the boat's rhythm. Coates spoke quietly. "They reacted fast yesterday. Too fast for a lone freighter." Adler nodded. He had been thinking the same thing. Someone out there was tightening the net. Up on the surface, aboard a small escort trawler named HMS Whetstone, Petty Officer Clark scanned the waves with binoculars while the engine rumbled beneath his boots. The Portwell had reported a torpedo wake during the night, and Whetstone had been diverted to investigate. The sky hung low, the clouds like thick wool pulled across the horizon. Clark tasted salt on the wind and squinted. Somewhere below him a German submarine might be moving, watching, waiting. The thought sent a prickling sensation along his neck. The first microstory of that day began with a scrap of coded transmission intercepted far to the west by an Allied listening post on the coast of Newfoundland. A wireless operator named Samuel Hargreaves sat alone in a wooden hut, headphones pressed to his ears, tuning through bursts of static until he caught the faint rhythmic click of an Enigma encoded message. He wrote the pattern on a sheet of paper quickly and passed it to his supervisor. Within hours, the signal was on its way to the decoding center, where analysts hoped to piece together which U-boats were patrolling which sectors. Hargreaves never learned the outcome. He simply returned to his desk, adjusted the headphones, and kept listening. But his single intercept would later help analysts map the movements of several submarines, including U-153. In U-153's control room, a faint tapping sound echoed through the hull. The men froze. Weiss raised a hand for silence. The tapping continued, irregular but unmistakable. Koch whispered, "That is not a natural sound." Weiss pressed his ear against the steel. The tapping faded, then returned. Could have been debris, could have been a shifting current, or it could be active sonar from a small escort somewhere above them. Weiss felt a chill move along his spine. He ordered the boat deeper. Pumps hissed. Gauges trembled. The hull creaked under the added pressure. At 200 feet, the tapping vanished, replaced by the low groan of the hull settling. Weiss wiped beads of moisture from his forehead. He wanted to surface at nightfall to recharge the batteries, but the tension in his chest told him they were being hunted. He paced the control room, listening, thinking, remembering a field report he had read weeks earlier about an American shipyard launching a new merchant vessel in record time. He had dismissed it then. Another boast, another rumor, but the detail gnawed at him now. While U-153 crept deeper, far across the ocean in Richmond, California, a welder named Rose Carter lowered her face shield as sparks scattered across the steel plates of a new Liberty ship hull. She was 23 years old, her gloves too large for her wrists, her arms sore from hours of holding the torch steady. The noise of the yard was constant and overwhelming. Metal on metal, grinding, hammering, engines rumbling. No one in her section spoke much over the roar, but they worked with a shared urgency. Foremen shouted schedules that grew shorter each week. Teams welded through the night under floodlights so bright the shadows seemed to vanish. They had been told the ships were needed immediately. They had been told men were dying at sea because supply ships were going down faster than they could be replaced. So Rose kept welding, sparks landing against her sleeves, sweat running into her mask. She did not know it, but the hull she worked on would be launched before the month ended. Back under the Atlantic, U-153 drifted at low speed. The air was becoming stale. Condensation gathered on the pipes. Men breathed slowly to conserve energy. Weiss finally gave the order. Surface at dusk. Run on diesel. Recharge. But stay sharp. The boat rode carefully through the dark water until the conning tower broke the surface. Salt spray lashed against the steel. Weiss opened the hatch and climbed up into the cold wind. The horizon glowed faintly under the dying light. Smooth seas. No ships in sight. Yet the tension refused to lift. Something had changed in the Atlantic. They all felt it. Below, Adler marked a note in the log. Increased escort activity. Faster response. Unknown threat increasing. He paused with his pencil above the page, then added a final line. Something is shifting out there. None of the men understood it yet. The change was quiet, nearly invisible, but it had begun, and soon the Atlantic would feel different in a way Germany had never expected. The following day dawned with a muted silver glow over the Atlantic, a calm surface masking the invisible contest unfolding beneath. U-153 cruised on the surface under low diesel power, making slow progress while the batteries recharged. The engines throbbed steadily, sending faint quivers through the steel deck. The wind carried a cold bite that stung the faces of the watch crew. Weiss stood in the conning tower with binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning for the slightest hint of a mast, a plume of smoke, or the glint of aircraft wings. Everything looked deceptively peaceful, but inside he carried a growing unease. During the night, the wireless operator had picked up a burst of Allied chatter on a frequency they rarely used. It was garbled, faint, and difficult to isolate, but he was sure it contained references to escort rerouting. Weiss reread the message scribbled on scrap paper. It made little sense on its own, yet something about the tone disturbed him. It hinted at coordination. It hinted at speed. He leaned against the rail as a wave slapped the hull. Something was shifting across the ocean, but the pattern remained just out of reach. Below deck, the atmosphere was tense but functional. Adler sat at the navigation desk, tracing the boat's projected course with a pencil worn down to its final inch. He checked drift calculations, fuel estimates, and the timing of their return to normal patrol depth. But a nagging thought followed him through the work. The escorts had felt too close yesterday, too precise, too early in the year for the Allies to have improved so sharply. He remembered a rumor passed during training that American industry was scaling in ways Europe could not imagine. Factories building parts before ships arrived. Supplies loaded before hulls touched the water. He dismissed it then as exaggeration. Now he wondered. In another corner of the Atlantic, aboard a British escort corvette named HMS Halberton, Lieutenant James Warren unfolded a fresh set of orders delivered by radio shortly after dawn. The message redirected his ship to join a new convoy departing Halifax within 48 hours. Warren read the instructions twice, noticing that several ships mentioned in the document had never appeared in earlier reports. He turned to the communications officer. "Are these new additions to the fleet simply seconded from other routes?" The officer shook his head. "They are brand new, sir. Launched faster than expected." Warren raised his eyebrows. Faster, he folded the orders and slipped them into his coat, a faint sense of disbelief stirring in his stomach. Meanwhile, far from the Atlantic, the sprawling Richmond shipyard, a foreman named Patrick Mallory gathered his team for a brief meeting beside the hull of a nearly complete Liberty ship. A cold breeze swept through the yard, carrying the clang of metal and the shouts of workers. Mallory held a clipboard full of revised schedules. He spoke loudly over the roar of welding torches behind him. "Washington wants this one in the water by the end of the week." A few of the welders exchanged weary glances. "That is impossible," one of them murmured. Mallory shook his head. "Not anymore. Kaiser wants another record. Sections are arriving preassembled." The men nodded slowly. The world was changing around them, and they were becoming part of something larger than they had ever imagined. Half a world away, one of those preassembled sections rolled off a flatbed truck from an inland steel plant that had switched from rail fabrication to ship production within months. A worker wrote a quick line in her small notebook during her lunch break. "They say the ships are needed faster than Germany can sink them." She closed the notebook and returned to the floor. Her work felt urgent, but she knew little about the fate of the ships once they left the yard. All she understood was the pressure, the speed, and the constant drive to do more. Back in U-153, the wireless operator approached Weiss with a hesitant look. He held a new signal intercept, faint and broken. "Sir, I think we are seeing a change in the pattern of their routing." Weiss frowned. "This early in the year, that seems unlikely." The operator glanced around before replying quietly. It also mentioned new tonnage already inbound. Weiss stared at him. Already inbound? How large? The operator shrugged. "Hard to know." The signal was weak, but the tone was confident. That one word lingered in Weiss's thoughts. Confident. Allied shipping should not feel confident in early 1942, not with U-boats sinking vessels across the Atlantic. Confidence was a sign of strength. It was a sign of information withheld. It was a sign of something Germany had not accounted for. At midday the sky began to darken, and the wind sharpened. Weiss ordered the boat to dive to periscope depth. The sea swallowed them slowly, the hull groaning as the waves closed overhead. Light faded. Sound became muted. In the cramped control room, men moved carefully around each other, the air already thick with humidity. Weiss raised the periscope. Water streaked down the lens. He rotated it slowly. Waves, clouds, nose cheeps. But the unease in his chest tightened. Something felt wrong in the silence. Minutes later, Adler approached with a plot sheet. Captain, based on intercept timing and convoy spacing, the Allies may be replacing shipping losses faster than before. Weiss set the sheet on the chart table and examined the numbers. Replacement rates were speculative, but the implications were impossible to ignore. If the Allies truly had found a way to accelerate production, then the entire U-boat strategy was in danger. Weiss lowered his voice. If they can replace a ship faster than we can sink one, the war changes. Adler nodded grimly. Yes, sir. Entirely. Outside the submarine, the Atlantic rolled on, unaware of the quiet turning point forming beneath its surface. Weiss did not know the cause. He did not know the scale. He did not know that the United States was beginning to launch Liberty ships in days rather than months. But he could feel the shift. Subtle, silent, inevitable. The turning point was coming, and none of them were ready for it. The shock began quietly, not with an explosion on the Atlantic or the sudden loss of a U-boat, but with a thin stack of papers that arrived at the Kriegsmarine's Naval Operations Office in Berlin on the morning of January 20, 1943. Outside, a dry winter wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the distant rumble of trolleys on Wilhelmstrasse. Inside the dim office, a young signals officer named Oberleutnant Karl Merz placed the latest Allied merchant production report on the polished desk of Captain zur See Ernst Merten. Merten did not look up at first. He was busy reading the casualty list from the previous week's patrols. Several U-boats had failed to report in. One was last heard from near Greenland. Another had transmitted a brief, garbled message about depth charges before going silent for good. When Merz cleared his throat, Morton finally lifted his eyes. What is it now? Merz asked quietly, as if expecting another report of a lost submarine. Merz handed him the folder. Sir, this one is different. It comes from the Armaments Ministry liaison. Merton opened it with the expectation that it would tell him what he already believed. That German industry would match whatever the Americans were building. That Allied ship production was straining. That the enemy was nearing its limit. Instead, the first line froze him. Richmond Yard No. 2 launched a Liberty ship in 4 days and 15 hours. Merton leaned back slowly, as if the chair itself had suddenly become unreliable. For days, he repeated out loud. Merz nodded once. And this is not an isolated case. Several shipyards are now producing them in 5 to 7 days routinely. There was a long silence in the office. Outside, a car horn blared faintly on the street below, swallowed quickly by the winter air. Merton exhaled once, long and controlled. Bring me all prior reports on American shipyard expansion, he said. All of them. By mid-afternoon, the Naval Operations Office had become a hive of disbelief. Papers littered the long wooden tables. Maps covered in pins marked every known American shipyard along both coasts. Technical diagrams of modular construction were analyzed and reanalyzed by officers who only a year earlier had dismissed Liberty ships as crude, slow, and unworthy of serious attention. A clerk sent for coffee twice, then stopped because no one touched it. The room grew thick with the sound of shuffling papers and low, uneasy murmurs. In the corner, Korvettenkapitän Dietrich Voss, one of the Kriegsmarine's most respected logistics analysts, pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and said what several others had already begun to fear. If the Americans can build faster than we can sink, the Battle of the Atlantic is lost. His voice was flat, not dramatic, a factual statement, delivered like the conclusion of a mathematical proof. At almost the same moment, hundreds of miles away, deep in the Atlantic swell, U-94 under Captain Lieutenant Otto was stalking what he believed was a vulnerable convoy. Cold water dripped from the ceiling of the control room as the submarine rode just beneath the surface. The hydrophone operator raised his head. "More screws approaching," he whispered. "Many more." Ice leaned in. The low hum of propellers grew into a dense, layered vibration. He frowned. That many ships did not make sense. The convoy he had been tracking should have counted no more than 20 vessels. But the sound now rolling through the hull suggested something closer to 50. Or more. "Surface depth," he ordered. The submarine rose slowly, water sliding down its metal skin. When the periscope broke the surface, Eitz wiped away the Atlantic spray and pressed his eye against the rubber cup. The horizon came into focus. Waves, smoke, columns of steam, and then he saw them. Liberty ships, dozens of them. Their silhouettes stretched across the gray water in a line that seemed to go on forever. "My God," he whispered. His first officer stepped closer. "Sir, that is impossible. We sank more tonnage last month than any month since 1940. How can there be this many?" Eitz did not answer. His throat had tightened. He moved the periscope slowly, sweeping the formation. Old ships mixed with new ones. Some so new their weld seams still gleamed under the filtered sunlight. Some carrying aircraft parts, some carrying food, some towing barges. And alongside them, American destroyers cut through the waves with a confidence that chilled him. Smoke from the convoy hung in long drifting layers, carried by the cold Atlantic wind. The sea was rough, but the line of ships held steady, as if guided by something deeper than formation discipline. As if driven by an endless supply behind them. Eitz lowered the periscope. The control room was silent. He could feel the eyes of his crew fixed on him, waiting for an explanation he did not have. He finally spoke. "The Americans have found a way to replace what we sink faster than we can sink it." For a few seconds, no one moved. It was as if the air itself had thickened. The message carried an unspoken truth. If the enemy could regenerate its merchant fleet at this speed, then the U-boat strategy, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, had just been punched in the stomach. Back in Berlin, the shock was quickly turning into dread. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat arm, arrived in the operations room just after nightfall. His presence brought a stiff, electric tension. Donitz was not a man easily shaken. Yet when he read the American launch rates, he closed his eyes for a moment and pressed his hand against his forehead. Not out of fatigue, out of understanding. He looked up at his staff. "Gentlemen, this means the Atlantic will flood with ships. We will never sink them all." One officer stepped forward. "But Her Admiral, our new U-boat designs, the Type 21 once deployed, will regain the advantage." Donitz shook his head. "Not soon enough. Not in these numbers." Outside the windows, snow began falling softly over Berlin. Inside, the realization spread like a slow-moving fire. Every assumption, every projection, every confidence built since 1940 was collapsing. German commanders did not lose their composure, but the truth hung heavy in the room. American industry had succeeded in performing what German officers once called impossible. They had made mass production itself a weapon. On the Atlantic, Otto Eitz finally stepped back from the periscope. His men watched him with growing unease. He felt the weight of command pulling at his shoulders. For the first time, he sensed the shadow of a greater force pressing against them. Not an enemy fleet, not a new weapon, but something far more relentless. Factories, cranes, welders working through the night. A nation building ships faster than his torpedoes could ever hope to destroy. He spoke quietly. "We continue the patrol. But understand this. The tide of this war is changing beneath us." The crew nodded, though their eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. The Atlantic swell rocked the submarine as it slipped deeper beneath the gray waves. Above them, the convoy moved westward, unbroken, illuminated faintly by the cold winter light that filtered through the clouds. The shock had arrived, and it was irreversible. Night settled over the North Atlantic like a heavy black curtain. But the sea did not rest. Wind carved white scars across the water. and waves slammed against steel hulls with a dull, rhythmic thunder. Far beneath the surface, U-94 pushed through the darkness at silent running speed. The crew spoke in whispers. Every metallic clang or shifting pipe felt too loud. As if the ocean itself were listening, Captain Lieutenant Otto Eitz stood near the chart table, one hand gripping an overhead rail as the submarine rolled gently left and right. He had not slept in nearly 20 hours, but fatigue was the least of his concerns. What he had seen through the periscope earlier that day still burned behind his eyes. The convoy was enormous, too enormous. Something beyond logic had shifted. The Americans were not simply replacing their losses. They were overwhelming them. A soft static broke through the control room as the radio man adjusted his headphones. "Sir," he whispered. "Faint contact from Bidu, Canada. Depth charge patterns increasing along the convoy perimeter." X nodded slowly. The escorts were tightening their screen. The message was clear. Liberty ships in vast numbers were no longer the only threat. Their protectors had multiplied as well. He raised his voice just enough for the crew to hear. "Bring us to periscope depth." The ballast tanks released a low groan as seawater shifted, lifting the submarine toward the surface. Droplets rained from the piping overhead. When the periscope broke through the dark water, Eitz wiped away the spray with the edge of his sleeve. He leaned in. Floodlights from the distant convoy flickered in the night, filtered through low fog and drifting smoke. Destroyers sliced back and forth along the defensive arc with purpose. Even at this distance, he could hear faint hums of engines carried by the wind. And beyond the escorts, the silhouettes of Liberty ships lined the horizon like an iron procession. Some were so new he could see their hull numbers still shining through the mist. He lowered the periscope. The quiet that followed was crushing. Far to the west, the convoy pressed on under the watchful eyes of the American Navy. Aboard one of the newest Liberty ships, the SS Joseph Stanton, the glow of welding torches still clung to the metal seams, casting faint reflections whenever moonlight hit the hull at the right angle. On the bridge, third mate Alan Harker scanned the ocean through binoculars. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the cold that clawed through every layer of clothing. He had been a machinist in Detroit a year earlier, putting together car parts. Now he was part of the lifeline feeding Britain's survival. Below deck, steam pipes hissed softly. The thrum of the engine vibrated through the floor, steady and confident. 2 weeks earlier, this ship had not existed. It had been nothing but pre-cut steel plates stacked in a Richmond yard, waiting for cranes and welders to transform them into a vessel. Harker knew this because his cousin worked in the Oregon shipyards and had written in a letter, "You'd be shocked to see how fast they go. Feels like watching a ship grow out of the ground." Up on the bridge, the convoy commander's voice crackled over the radio. "Maintain spacing. Escorts reporting U-boat activity northeast quadrant. All ships stay dark." The reminder sent a ripple of tension through every crew member. The Atlantic was still a battlefield, but something felt different now. The fear was not gone, but it was no longer accompanied by dread. The ships were too many, too steady, too new. Back in Berlin, the break in confidence arrived with the force of a hammer. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz stood at a large map table in a room lit by a single overhead lamp. His staff arranged reports in neat stacks, though their hands moved with an anxious stiffness. One officer read aloud the most recent intelligence summary. American output in December exceeded 500,000 tons. Kaiser yards breaking previous records weekly. Donitz inhaled sharply and stepped closer to the map. For months he had relied on calculations that assumed one reality: that German torpedoes destroyed merchant ships faster than Allied industry could replace them. It had been true once. For a brief moment in 1942, victory in the Atlantic seemed within reach. But now, these numbers, they shatter our entire strategy. Chief of Staff Eberhard Gott spoke quietly. "If American production continues at this rate, Admiral, they will replace in 1 month what we think in 3. Donitz did not look up. He knew Gott was right. Germany had lost the Battle of the Atlantic before fully realizing it. Not through a single dramatic naval clash, not through a catastrophic loss of submarines, but through something colder, quieter, and more relentless: industrial power. On the Atlantic floor, a different kind of collapse began in the steel-walled silence of U-94. Otto Eitz stood motionless as his first officer approached. "Sir, we have a firing solution if we want to attempt an attack run tonight. Fogish seek. Convoy speed is consistent. We have a chance." A chance. The word felt heavy, almost ironic. Eitz pictured the line of Liberty ships stretching across the horizon. Even if he sank 1 or 2 tonight, 10 more would be launched before the week ended. And every U-boat he lost in the process would take months to replace. He closed his eyes. Then he shook his head. No attack. Hold position. The order stunned the control room. Men stopped moving. 2 crewmen exchanged uncertain glances. One whispered under his breath. But Eitz remained steady. "Attacking in these conditions was suicide," he said calmly. "And suicide achieves nothing." Silence settled again, deep and absolute. The submarine slowly drifted in the cold, dark water, a lone predator slowly realizing that the ocean no longer belonged to it. Above them, the convoy surged onward, its engines humming through the night, its steel hulls gleaming under the moonlit fog, a living demonstration of a truth that Germany could no longer deny. The breakthrough had come, and it had not come from the sea, nor from a fleet, nor from a new weapon. It had come from shipyards lit like burning suns, from welders who worked without sleep, from cranes that lifted entire hull sections at once, from American industry turning speed itself into a weapon. The Atlantic had shifted, and nothing would ever swing it back. Dawn crept over the Atlantic in a muted gray, the kind of light that softened every edge but revealed every truth. The seas had calmed slightly after the night squall, but the cold remained sharp, settling into the bones of every sailor who stood watch. A faint mist hung over the water like a veil, drifting slowly between ships of the convoy. As the Liberty ships pushed forward, their engines throbbed with steady confidence, but inside their steel hulls the human cost of the night weighed heavily. On the SS Joseph Stanton, third mate Alan Harker leaned against the outer rail, his breath forming small clouds in the morning chill. The horizon stretched endlessly in all directions, a gray expanse blending sea and sky. He had barely slept, not because of danger, but because his thoughts would not let him. At some point past midnight, a whisper passed along the deck that an escort destroyer had picked up the faint signature of a U-boat. It never materialized into an attack, but that knowledge alone was enough to keep nerves on edge. He kept replaying the possibility in his mind, hearing the ship groan under the torque of a torpedo blast, the sudden rush of freezing water, the screams. When he finally closed his eyes, he saw the welded seams of the hull glowing in his imagination. Not the terror of destruction, but the miracle of creation. Someone had built this ship. Someone had labored in a cloud of sparks and smoke. Someone had hammered steel and tightened bolts and wiped sweat from their brow. And that someone had done it so quickly that even if the ship were lost, another would already be sliding down a launchway somewhere in America. Below deck, mess crews prepared a simple breakfast. The smell of oatmeal mixed with the lingering scent of engine oil. The men moved quietly, the fatigue of the long night hanging over them. Some ate in silence. Some stared at their tin bowls as if lost in distant thoughts. A few tried to joke, but their laughter felt strained. In the engine room, Chief Engineer Malcolm Pierce wiped grime from his hands with a rag blackened from weeks of use. He listened to the steady hum of the machinery, running his fingers over the copper lines with a practiced sensitivity. Every vibration told a story. Every pulse of heat reminded him of the firestorm of activity that had created this vessel. He had worked in a Pennsylvania mill before the war and understood steel, but he had never imagined watching ships come together in weeks. Sometimes he had seen photographs of prefabricated hull sections waiting in neat rows like giant metal ribs. He had seen workers standing shoulder to shoulder on scaffolding, welding in synchronized rhythm under blinding sparks. Those thoughts calmed him as much as the engine's steady pulse. Across the ocean, in Germany, the aftermath took another shape entirely. Captain Lieutenant Otto Eitz stood on the conning tower of U-94 after surfacing at dawn to recharge batteries. The cold air whipped against his face as he stared at the empty horizon. The sea looked deceptively peaceful. His crew moved about the deck with subdued urgency, checking lines, ventilating compartments, scanning the distance for enemy aircraft. The silence among them was not fear. It was something heavier, something closer to resignation. The night had revealed a truth they had felt creeping in for months. Their efforts no longer shifted the balance of the war. Their skill, their discipline, their courage, none of it mattered against the tide of industrial power rising from across the ocean. Below deck, 19-year-old machinist mate Ernest Keller sat alone beside the torpedo room bulkhead, his hands clasped tightly. He had joined the Kriegsmarine with a sense of pride, believing he would be part of a decisive force. But the reality he saw now was different. Every torpedo they fired was swallowed by a sea filled with new ships. His greatest fear was not death. His greatest fear was that he was becoming irrelevant. In Berlin, the shock rippled through command rooms thick with cigarette smoke. Officers who once spoke with confidence now argued in clipped tones. Reports stacked high on polished desks told the same story. Losses increasing, results diminishing, replacements inadequate. Donitz read one particular message over and over, a dispatch from a U-boat commander who had described seeing a convoy larger than any he had imagined possible. And behind that convoy came more ships, and more, and more. It was not simply a military crisis. It was a psychological blow that cracked the foundation of German naval doctrine. Meanwhile, back in the convoy, another kind of aftermath unfolded. One of the older freighters, battered by storms and long service, had lost a boiler during the night. The fog-thick air carried faint sounds of hammers and shouted instructions as repair crews labored on the open deck. Sparks flew in short bursts as men tried to patch a ruptured line. The wounded ship limped forward, refusing to fall behind. Next to her, a Liberty ship eased closer to offer support. One sailor on the damaged vessel stared at the new Liberty ship beside them in awe. Her hull plates still shone with fresh paint. Her mast cables were tight. Her engines purred with youthful energy. He shook his head and whispered to no one in particular. "They build them faster than we can break them." The phrase passed between ships. Some men repeated it with pride. Others repeated it with disbelief. But in the hearts of those fighting to keep this convoy alive, the meaning was clear. For the first time in years, survival did not feel like a desperate gamble. Felt achievable. The aftermath was not marked by victory songs or celebration. It was quieter, more human, a shared breath of relief among weary sailors, a shift in the ocean's mood, a sense that the tide, at long last, was turning. The sea had claimed countless ships, countless lives. But now, in the growing daylight, a new truth floated across the waves. The Atlantic was no longer a graveyard. It was becoming a lifeline again. The realization did not come suddenly like an explosion or a single dramatic message. It seeped in quietly, carried by the slow rhythm of the sea and the steady heartbeat of engines. It emerged in small moments, in the tired eyes of sailors watching the horizon, in the clipped tone of German radio transmissions, in factory whistles echoing across American shipyards. Came as a truth that no one could ignore anymore. The Battle of the Atlantic was changing, not because one side fought harder, but because one side could simply outbuild the other. Aboard the Liberty ship SS Joseph Stanton, Captain Harold Milburn stood on the bridge with his hands resting on the cold metal railing. The rising sun cast a pale glow across the convoy, revealing ships spread across the water like iron shadows moving in formation. Not long ago, a convoy of this size would have been unthinkable. Too risky, too difficult to assemble, too vulnerable to U-boat wolf packs. But now the ocean looked different. Instead of scattered survivors clinging to hope, an entire floating city moved with purpose. Harold watched the column behind him stretch back into the fog and felt something stir inside him. It was not arrogance. It was not triumph. It was simply the quiet understanding that the war's momentum had shifted. He remembered the early days of the conflict when British and American commanders worried that convoys were too thinly protected. He remembered stories of ships burning on the horizon, of torpedo wakes slicing through black water, of panic breaking across merchant decks as hulls tore apart. Many of his friends had been lost during those years. Now he leaned forward slightly, listening to the hum of his ship, feeling the vibration under his boots, and understood that every sound he heard existed because thousands of people on the other side of the world had bent steel, welded seams, and worked through exhaustion to keep these ships sailing. In the officers' mess, radio operator Frank Atwood sipped a cup of bitter coffee and stared at a message he had copied an hour earlier. It was an intercepted German transmission, heavily fragmented by distance and static. But one line stood out clearly, repeated twice by an anxious U-boat commander. "Their production cannot be matched." Frank reread the sentence, his fingers tracing the ink on the page. He knew enough German to understand the weight of those words. It was not a tactical observation. It was a confession, a realization whispered through clenched teeth. Below deck, several stokers sat along the bulkhead, resting against the warm steel after their shift. They talked in low voices, trading rumors about how quickly Liberty ships were being launched now. One man spoke of a ship that had gone from keel laying to launch in under 5 days. Another swore he had heard of even faster attempts. There was a sense of awe in their voices, but also something deeper forming beneath it. A belief, a conviction that what they were fighting for was backed by an industrial force unlike anything the world had ever seen. Thousands of miles away, on the other side of the war, a very different realization settled over the men fighting beneath the waves. In the cramped control room of U-94, Captain Lieutenant Otto Eitz leaned forward over the navigation table, his face illuminated by the soft red glow of battle lamps. Charts, scribbled coordinates, and radio intercepts covered the surface. He traced the patterns with a gloved finger and saw the same story unfolding across every patrol sector. More convoys, more escorts, more ships. His executive officer, Oberleutnant Erich Mollmann, stood beside him with a weary expression. Neither man spoke for several minutes. They had both read the intelligence reports. They had both seen the growing lists of Liberty ships launched. They had both listened to fellow commanders describe their patrols with frustration and disbelief. U-boat tactics depended on scarcity, on overwhelming lightly defended convoys, on bleeding the enemy faster than he could heal. But now the enemy healed instantly. Every loss was replaced, every sinking erased by the next launch. The mathematics of war had turned against them. Otto finally exhaled, a quiet breath that sounded almost like surrender, not of spirit but of expectation. Above the waterline, early morning light glimmered across the Atlantic swells. The ocean had always been the great equalizer, capable of humbling any navy. But now it favored the side that could fill it with ships faster than the sea could claim them. The Germans understood this, even if no formal acknowledgement would ever appear in official reports. It existed in the tightening of their jaws, in the fatigue etched into their faces, in the silence that followed each failed attack. Back in Washington, naval planners had realized it too, not through emotion or pride, but through numbers. Charts pinned to walls showed production curves climbing higher each month. Yard supervisors sent telegrams reporting faster build times, fewer delays, and more efficient assembly lines. Factories had turned into ecosystems of steel and sweat, where thousands of workers moved with synchronized precision. The realization was not that victory was assured, but that defeat was no longer inevitable. In London, British intelligence officers gathered around large convoy boards, marking ship movements with colored pins. For the first time since 1940, the board looked balanced. Losses had slowed, arrivals had increased. Supplies flowed steadily again into British ports. They saw the same truth spreading across the war map. The initiative was shifting westward. They had survived the worst. Now they could begin to push back. On the Liberty ship deck, as the morning grew brighter, Alan Harker stepped outside and rested his forearms on the rail. The wind tugged at his coat. He looked at the long line of ships ahead, each one heavy with cargo that would keep Britain alive. He watched their hulls rise and fall with the swell, and for the first time since joining the Merchant Marine, He felt something stronger than fear or determination. He felt certainty, a certainty born not from hope, but from steel, from wells, from factories that never slept, from workers who built ships faster than the enemy could destroy them. The realization spread through him like warmth in the cold morning air. Germany could not stop this. No U-boat pack could stop this. The Atlantic was no longer theirs. The tide of war was shifting not by chance, but by creation. And everyone involved, from welders in Oregon to sailors in the cold seas, could feel it. In the long view of history, the moment when Liberty ships began sliding into the Atlantic in rapid succession stands as one of the decisive turning points of the Second World War. It was not a famous battle or a diplomatic negotiation. It did not involve a single heroic commander or a dramatic assault on enemy lines. Instead, it was the quiet, relentless force of industrial will that reshaped the trajectory of the war. What happened at the American shipyards in 1942 and 1943 revealed a truth that commanders on both sides would ultimately have to accept. Wars are not won only on the battlefield, but in the factories, on the assembly lines, and in the hands of workers who never see the front. Historians today often describe the Liberty ship program as a triumph of scale, innovation, and urgency. Yet its deeper significance lies in how it altered the strategic foundations of the entire Atlantic conflict. Before the mass production surge, the German U-boat fleet appeared to hold a decisive advantage. Their unrestricted submarine warfare threatened to isolate Britain, cut vital supply lines, and starve the island nation into capitulation. For a time, the German Admiralty believed the numbers were on their side. They calculated tonnage sunk versus tonnage built and saw victory approaching. But the introduction of modular construction and welded hulls, combined with the massive mobilization of American labor, transformed those numbers into a weapon of their own. The shipyards effectively nullified German strategy. Every torpedoed ship was replaced faster than it could be reported lost. Every U-boat patrol returned to find more vessels on the water than when it had departed. The logic of attrition, once a German strength, became their weakness. The historical legacy of this shift reaches far beyond the tactical realities of 1942. For generations, historians have emphasized that the true power of the United States in World War II was not simply its military might, but its industrial capacity. The Liberty ship became the clearest symbol of that capacity. Built in dozens of coastal shipyards by men and women who had never before worked in heavy industry, these vessels embodied the idea that a democracy could outproduce authoritarian regimes. They demonstrated that mass participation and mobilization could achieve results previously thought impossible. The psychological impact was equally profound. For the Allies, the rapid construction of Liberty ships restored confidence at a moment when despair had begun to take hold. British leaders, who had watched convoy losses climb to catastrophic levels, found hope in the steady arrival of new vessels. The British public, weary from years of rationing and bombing, saw in these ships a promise of resilience and continuity. Supplies would continue to arrive. The island would not fall. For Germany, the realization that Allied production had surged beyond their capacity to counter created a shadow that darkened every subsequent naval plan. Admirals who had once believed they could sever the transatlantic lifeline now spoke in more cautious tones. U-boat aces who had built reputations on aggressive hunting found that their prey was no longer dwindling. In later war diaries, several commanders wrote candidly about their growing frustration as convoys became more numerous, better defended, and increasingly difficult to disrupt. Their recognition of the shifting balance did not come from a single defeat, but from the slow accumulation of undeniable evidence. From a strategic perspective, the consequences were far-reaching. The stabilized supply lines allowed the United States and Britain to amass the equipment needed for large-scale operations. Without the consistent flow of material delivered by Liberty ships, the North African campaign would have faltered. The invasions of Sicily and Italy would have been delayed or diminished. The build-up for Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious assault in history, would have been impossible. The armored divisions, aircraft, fuel stocks, medical supplies, and food that poured into Britain were all carried aboard vessels born from the same shipyards that had stunned German intelligence. Even after the war, the Liberty ship left an indelible mark on maritime history. Many continued serving for decades, carrying cargo across global trade routes. Others found new life as training vessels, breakwaters, or museum ships. Their longevity reinforced their reputation not as disposable wartime expedients, but as durable symbols of American industrial strength. In academic discussions, the Liberty Ship program is frequently cited as a case study in innovation under pressure. It demonstrated how unconventional thinking, such as replacing riveted construction with welding and adopting assembly line principles, could revolutionize an entire industry. It also showcased the effectiveness of standardized design. By creating a single, efficient model and producing it at scale, shipyards eliminated bottlenecks that had previously slowed naval construction. Yet the deepest legacy of the Liberty ships may lie in the people who built them. The program drew workers from every background: farmers, machinists, immigrants, women entering industrial labor for the first time. Their collective efforts reshaped the workforce and laid the groundwork for post-war economic transformation. Many historians argue that the rise of the American middle class owes part of its origins to the mass mobilization and industrial boom initiated during these years. Looking back, it becomes clear that the German commanders who expressed shock at the speed of Liberty ship construction were not merely reacting to an engineering accomplishment. They were witnessing the emergence of a force that would define the remainder of the war. The factories, the welders, the cranes, the assembly lines, all of these elements formed a machine of national determination. That machine produced more than ships, produced momentum, produced stability. It produced the logistical backbone required to liberate Europe. In the quiet reflection of historical distance, one understands why the moment mattered so profoundly. When Liberty ships began launching in days, the Atlantic was no longer a contested graveyard. It became a highway of liberation, a path upon which an entire coalition would march toward victory. And the war, in its vast complexity, shifted forever because of what happened in those American shipyards. Because steel was shaped faster than fear, because innovation outpaced destruction, and because a free nation proved that its greatest weapon was its capacity to build.